Hello to all. Another episode of Mazda's 626 Millenia's MX6, and this can possibly apply to many other vehicles. Well, for the most part, this is actually obtained from the Mazda repair book. We're gonna go over a few of the check engine codes, and I'm gonna talk in detail about the most common ones, or at least the ones that I have seen with vehicles or this particular vintage of vehicles. Overall, I have owned, and I still do, two of these type of cars. 2002 Mazda 626 EX, which basically means it's 6 cylinders, 2 banks, V6, and also the Mazda Millenia, which, to my knowledge, they were all made with a V6 engine type style. Now, both of these cars the engines are identical. A few minor changes to the engine. Can't really speak about the transmission though. They do look alike. They do behave a little different in both my cars, so I really can't speak about the transmission being identical. But let's go over a few things in here. And for those that are just wondering if I'm gonna show how to test a few of these sensors, not in this video. Some of these sensors require a power probe, test light, and also a multimeter, both to the sensor and to the wiring. So we'll get to that at some other point down the road, hopefully. But we're going to start with the first line, which is PO100, the PO102, and the PO103. Basically, it's pointing to the mass airflow sensor. Alright, so it's very basic, to the point. The mass airflow sensor, just doesn't mean that it has failed. Basically means that you should focus your attention over there. And do not just throw a mass airflow sensor in there. Some of the sensors can bankrupt you. They are very pricey. With the mass airflow, right off the bat, I would check to look at the sensor. Do not touch it. Do not clean it with the first thing you see. They make a specific fluid for mass airflow sensor. And I have gotten cars, not for a Mazda though, where they say, well, I took it to the mechanic, he cleaned the mass airflow sensor, and when I check on the code, it's pointing to the mass airflow sensor. I look at it, they clean it from one side and the other side is dirty. Don't ask me how this happened, but it's happened to me twice where I get cars in and basically it's what I find. Usually I do not like to take them out, but if I have to, I will. Some of them actually live inside of a container or a hose or something like that. And you can take the hose after you take it off the harness and look at it from both sides. That way I do not risk of dropping it to the ground and dropping it on the small filaments, getting it dirty again. And this sensor is very, very sensitive. So buy the special can for it. It's probably like $6-7. You might say that you will never use it, but I'd rather pay $6-7 for a can of mass airflow cleaner than buying a sensor itself. Alright, so let's say that you cleaned it, you put it together, you clear the code, and it comes back. What next? Well, I will also check at the wiring, the harness. Make sure it's in good condition, nothing bent, nothing kinked. The sensor itself has a clip. Make sure it has not snapped off. It's made out of plastic. They usually break. So check on that. On the Mazda, if I'm not mistaken, the mass airflow in both my Mazdas, they have 5 wires. Hopefully down the road we can actually go over some of the wiring diagram or a live footage of the wiring itself. And that's all there is to it. If I'm not mistaken, on the Millenia, the mass airflow sensor is with the airbox. On the 626, it's somewhere around that vicinity. I can't think of it now. I know that the airbox are different, but usually it's around that vicinity. Usually it's way before the throttle body. So check between the throttle body and before and the airbox. Alright, so inlet air temperature, AIT. Alright, so I've seen this in many places. I've seen this on the intake manifold. I've seen it after the throttle body. I've seen it before the throttle body, after the mass airflow. Check them. If I could actually, when I can, I'll go down and check on a live footage which sensor is what on the Mazdas. So same thing again. If I'm not mistaken, the air inlet is either a 2-prong or a 3-prong. Positive and negative, and the 5-volt reference back to the computer. So first, check the wiring harness to make sure that is doing what it's supposed to be doing. Feeding and bringing information back. Usually on the 3 prongs, from left to right, the left one and the outer one, positive and negative, and the middle one usually is the 5-volt reference going back to the computer with the information that the sensor itself obtained. Alright, moving on. P0115, P0117, P0118. Engine coolant temperature sensor. Now, this is not to be mistaken with the thermostat. It may be related, but on the Mazdas, on the left-hand side, on the engine, if you're looking straight at it, there is a engine coolant temperature sensor, and usually there are 2 prongs. If I'm not mistaken, that sensor it creates a resistance, and given the amount of voltage, it will actually send feedback back to the computer. I could be wrong. It could be a 3-prong, but we'll get to that later on when we identify which sensor is what. Throttle position sensor, TPS. This actually is bolted to the throttle body. My camera's dying. And on this one, the throttle position sensor is actually bolted into the throttle body. On the Mazdas, there are fixed positions. You can't really adjust them or anything. It's just a straight and bolt, 2-bolt sensor. On older cars, you could actually tilt them and adjust them that way. Not much to it. Same thing. Check the wiring itself before you condemn the sensor. Sensors are not there to make your day bad. They're just telling you that something is wrong. Doesn't necessarily mean that the sensor is bad or the wiring is bad. It's probably telling you that something around that area is triggering that sensor to go off. Alright, P0125. Excessive time to enter a closed loop. It sounds like an electrical problem to me. Never seen it, never dealt with it. So, moving on. So, you have a few oxygen sensors codes here. So the first one, P0130, 131, and 150. The sensor or the circuit fault. Circuit fault is actually the wiring. The sensor itself, it can be bad. I actually have replaced quite a few of them. They're made out of ceramic. When you install them, make sure you do not contaminate the sensor itself. Put a little bit of anti-seize on the threads to make sure it doesn't seize in with the pipe, the exhaust pipe. It does get pretty hot, so it kind of welds in there a little bit. It seizes. P0133, P0134, P0140. The sensor again, but this time it's actually being more specific. It's responding slow. For this type of slow response sensors, get a live scanner, plug it into the computer, and watch the O2 sensors to see how it behaves. Make sure that it's giving a voltage reference back to the computer. It's all over the place. Usually it should give back a reference of 1 volt. Certain vehicles may be different. P0154, P0160. Same thing again. If I'm not mistaken, that actually pertains to the rear bank, or the bank that's actually closest to the firewall on that car. If I'm not mistaken, that is also on the exhaust manifold before the cat. P0135, P0141, P0155. Sensor heater or circuit fault. Pretty much looks at that area as well. Never dealt with them on the Mazdas. Alright, moving on to P0170, P0171. System fuel running too lean. If the computer has to compensate more gasoline because air is at fault, or it's just not getting enough air, look into that. Now, P0172 and P0173, system is running too rich. Also get a live scanner to look at what's going on. Usually the boot before the throttle body cracks, and this is both true on the Millenia and the 626 that I own. They crack, top, bottom, left and right, you name it, or it's not properly set. That can set off that code, or those few codes. One time somebody brought me a car, 626, and the mass airflow sensor was disconnected. So the computer didn't know how much air it was getting. So it was actually giving me both banks running poor, running too lean. But again, it had no knowledge how much air was going into the system. So moving on. And I've seen a lot of those codes before I move on. The P0170, the 171, 172, 173. Too many of them out there, and I fixed 60% of them by looking at cracked boots, hoses, and one time at a PCV hose that was cracked, which was actually making the car run very, very poor. Fuel pump circuit fault. That's P0230, 231, 232. Check out the wiring. Not really. I never had an issue with fuel pumps with the Mazdas. Only one time, but it was the fact that the customer liked to run the car on empty, and the vehicle and fuel pumps, no matter what car you have, it self-lubricates itself with the presence of gasoline. So if you are running the car too many times, you're going to see this code soon. You're going to blow that pump, you're going to run it dry, and it's going to just stop working. On these cars, the fuel pump is inside of the tank itself. It is a pain in the you-know-what to drop down. This can be avoided. That's just it. And also try not to put like cheap gas on it, because dirt and debris can actually clog it up. Misfires. So P01, P0301. So look at the last digit. It will tell you which cylinder is at fault. 1 through 6, 1 through 8, 1 through 12. It depends on the vehicle. But that array of the 300s and on is actually reserved for the cylinder position. What can cause misfires? A lot. Typical is, of course, a bad spark plug. That's one. You can actually have a misfire by having a broken ignition wire to it. One. Second, I've actually seen broken steel gaskets or any type of gasket in the intake where the injector is, and it's just not running right. Air is leaking in there. So it can misfire. It also can create a vacuum leak. Possibly a weak or bad injector. I don't really have issues with injectors. However, if you have an issue, inspect it, clean it, and also check if you take the injector out of its fuel rail, look at the O-ring that lives in it. And that's true for all 6 cylinders. So, ignition input circuit fault. PO320. Now, never dealt with those. I've seen a few cases where it's the ignition itself when you put the key inside of the car, the ignition switch. But more often than not, check the ignition, the coil, everything. Never seen this before in my cars. I've seen it in other tutorials. Check those out. Maybe that can help you out. So that's it with that one. So I'm gonna pause it here. I'm gonna take a small break. I'm gonna end this part 1 of check engine codes for the Mazdas.